What if I told you that some of America's most comforting recipes were cooked without a single electric appliance? From wood-fired ovens to hand-cranked churns, the Amish preserved cooking methods that most of us have forgotten entirely. Today, we're uncovering 25 lost Amish recipes that fed generations through hard work, faith, and the simplest ingredients imaginable. Some will make you want to fire up your own wood stove, others will remind you what cooking used to mean. Let's step back in time. Number 1. Schnitz on Knepp, dried apple dumplings with ham. Let's start with the dish that defined Pennsylvania Dutch country for over 2 centuries. Schnitz and Knepp dried apples and dumplings sound simple until you understand the process. Amish families would slice apples in late summer, thread them on strings, and hang them in the summer kitchen to dry for weeks. Come winter, those leathery apple rings became the foundation of this one-pot meal. The recipe: dried apples soaked overnight, cooked with a ham hock in a cast-iron Dutch oven over the wood stove, hours of slow simmering. Then, fluffy dumplings made from flour, baking powder, butter, and milk dropped directly into the bubbling broth. The kitchen smelled like sweet apples, smoky ham, and rising dough. The dumplings absorbed the ham-apple broth, becoming soft pillows of comfort. The dried apples plumped back to life, sweet and tender. This was Sunday dinner in Lancaster County, the meal that required Saturday preparation and Sunday patience. The one your great-grandmother made in a kitchen with no refrigerator, no electric mixer, no microwave to reheat leftovers. The dried apples meant survival through winter when fresh fruit was impossible. The ham hock was what remained after a hog butchering. The dumplings were made from pantry staples that every Amish kitchen kept on hand. This wasn't convenience food. This was devotion on a plate. Number 2. Funeral pie. Raisin pie. Yes, it's actually called funeral pie. And yes, it was specifically made for funerals because unlike cream pies or custards, this one didn't need refrigeration. Raisins, boiled with sugar, lemon juice, and cornstarch until they formed a thick, glossy filling. Poured into a hand-rolled pie crust, topped with a lattice, and baked in the wood oven until golden. The filling was sweet tart, with a molasses-like depth from the raisins. The crust was flaky, made with lard that Amish women rendered themselves from their own pigs. When someone in the community died, the women would gather at the grieving family's home, rolling out pie crusts at the kitchen table, their hands moving in synchronized rhythm perfected over decades. They'd bake dozens of these pies in outdoor bake ovens, feeding the funeral attendees who came from surrounding farms. These pies could sit on the table for hours in summer heat without spoiling. They were sweet enough to comfort, but simple enough to make in bulk. They were love expressed through lard and raisins. Raisin pie had staying power literally. In communities without electricity, food preservation determined what you could serve. Funeral pie solved that problem with old-world ingenuity. The tradition is fading. Younger generations have refrigeration. Modern funerals serve catered sandwiches. But in some Amish communities, funeral pie still appears at viewings, a reminder that food and faith have always been intertwined. Number 3. Shoofly Pie. Wet bottom. The most iconic Amish dessert, with a name nobody can quite explain and a recipe that divides communities into 2 camps: wet bottom or dry bottom. The wet bottom version, the original, has a gooey molasses layer on the bottom, topped with a cinnamon brown sugar crumb mixture. Baked until the top is crispy and the bottom is like sticky toffee. The filling was just molasses, boiling water, and baking soda, creating a reaction that made the mixture foam and lighten. The crumb topping was flour, brown sugar, butter, and cinnamon, worked together by hand until it formed pea-sized pieces. The name. The most popular theory says flies were attracted to the sweet molasses filling cooling on windowsills and cooks had to shoo them away. Another theory suggests the molasses was so sweet you had to shoo people away from eating it before dinner. This was breakfast pie. Yes, breakfast. Amish families would eat a slice with black coffee at 5 a.m. before heading to the barn for morning milking. The molasses provided quick energy, and the sugar kept you going through hours of physical labor. Shoofly Pie. Pie was invented because molasses was cheap and shelf-stable. Eggs and milk spoiled, molasses lasted forever in the cellar. During lean times, you could make this pie when the chickens weren't laying and the cow had gone dry. The pie baked in wood ovens that required constant temperature monitoring, adding a log here, adjusting the damper there. Amish women knew their ovens like musicians know their instruments. Baking by instinct developed over thousands of loaves. Number 4. Haystack Dinner. This wasn't a recipe, it was an event. A build-your-own deconstructed taco salad before that concept existed in mainstream America. White rice on the bottom. Then, layers. Ground beef cooked with onions in a cast-iron skillet. Shredded lettuce, diced tomatoes, canned in summer, from the cellar in winter, crushed saltine crackers, shredded cheese, and the secret weapon, a sweet peanut butter sauce made with peanut butter, milk, and molasses, heated on the stovetop and drizzled over everything. Every component was prepared in separate bowls and set out on a long table. Each person built their own haystack, layering ingredients to their preference. The final tower was chaotic, colorful, and surprisingly delicious. This was church supper food, wedding food, barn-raising food, any gathering where the community came together. The beauty was in its flexibility. No electricity needed, every ingredient could be prepared ahead, and even the pickiest eater could customize their plate. The peanut butter sauce was the controversial element. Some families swore by it, others thought it was too sweet. There were Amish communities where suggesting peanut butter sauce at Haystack Dinner would start a genuine debate. The dish originated in Amish communities in the Midwest in the 1970s to 80s as a way to feed large groups efficiently. Spread through Amish communities via handwritten recipe cards passed between cousins and church friends. Today, haystack dinners still happen in Amish communities and Mennonite churches, but they've started appearing at school fundraisers and community potlucks, the Amish contribution to American food culture quietly spreading. Number 5. Preaching cookies. Church cookies. These weren't fancy. They were meant to keep children quiet during 3-hour church services. Sugar cookies, but dense and sturdy, made with lard, molasses, and just enough sugar to be interesting. Cut into simple shapes or dropped by spoonfuls onto baking sheets, baked until firm enough to survive being carried in coat pockets. The texture was somewhere between a cookie and a biscuit firm, slightly chewy, not too sweet. They wouldn't crumble into a million pieces when a 5-year-old clutched one in their fist during the sermon. Amish church services are held in homes, rotating through community members' houses. The benches would be set up in the main room, families arriving by horse and buggy at dawn. Services would last 3 to 4 hours, all in Pennsylvania. Dutch, German, and children were expected to sit quietly the entire time. Enter the preaching cookie. Mothers would slip these into little hands when restlessness began. The children would nibble slowly, making one cookie last 30 minutes, giving parents a blessed window of quiet. These were baked on Saturday in preparation for Sunday church. No baking on Sunday, that was the Sabbath. So, Saturday afternoons meant baking dozens of these cookies in wood-fired ovens, storing them in crocks with tight lids. The molasses was key, it kept the cookies moist for days without refrigeration. The lard made them tender, despite being sturdy. This was engineering as much as baking. Number 8. Dandelion gravy with fried eggs. Before we bought lettuce in plastic bags, Amish families foraged their first greens of spring from their own yards. Dandelion greens, picked young before they turned bitter, wilted in hot bacon grease in a cast-iron skillet. Then, a gravy made by adding flour to the bacon fat, creating a roux, and whisking in milk and vinegar until it formed a creamy, tangy sauce, poured over the wilted greens, topped with fried eggs, the yolks still runny, served with thick slices of homemade bread. This was April food, when winter stores were running low and the first edible things appeared in the yard. The dandelions cost nothing. The eggs were fresh from the chickens. The milk and cream were from the morning milking. The taste was bitter, sweet, tangy, rich, all at once. The bacon grease, the tart vinegar, the creamy milk, the peppery greens, the rich egg yolk, it was complexity born from simplicity. Your great-grandmother, walking through the yard with a paring knife, cutting dandelion greens before they flowered. The smell of bacon frying while your great-grandfather came in from the barn. Breakfast on the table by 6 a.m., fueling a 12-hour workday. This represented Amish food philosophy. Waste nothing. Use what God provides. Make it taste good anyway. The recipe required no refrigeration. Greens picked fresh. Eggs gathered that morning. No electricity cooked on wood stove. And no money. All ingredients from the farm. Number 7. Rivvel soup. Drop noodle soup. When your grandmother said she made this with her fingers, she meant it literally. Rivvel soup was chicken broth made from an old hen who stopped laying eggs, brought to a boil in a cast-iron pot hanging over the fire. Then, flour and egg mixed by hand in a bowl until crumbly. Rubbed between your fingers to create pea-sized pieces of dough, dropped directly into the boiling broth. The dough bits cooked in minutes, creating tiny, irregular dumplings. Some dissolved slightly, thickening the broth. Others stayed intact, providing texture. The name comes from the German word reiben, meaning to rub. The act of rubbing flour and egg between your fingers to create the dough bits was the technique. This was sick day food. When children had colds, when adults were recovering from hard labor injuries, when new mothers needed gentle nourishment, Rivvel soup appeared. The chicken broth was always from chickens they'd raised and butchered themselves. An old rooster or spent-laying hen would simmer for hours on the back of the wood stove until the broth was golden and rich. Then the meat would be stripped from the bones and added back to the soup with the Rivvel. Making this required no measuring cups. Experienced cooks did it by feel. The dough should be crumbly but not dry, just wet enough to hold together when squeezed. This was knowledge passed from grandmother to daughter through touch, not recipes. Number 8. Church spread. Peanut butter church spread. After 3 hours of church service, the community would gather for a simple lunch, and the centerpiece was always church spread. Peanut butter, marshmallow cream, or corn syrup if marshmallow wasn't available, and sometimes maple syrup, mixed together until smooth and spreadable. The ratio varied by community, but the result was always sweet, sticky, and substantial. Spread thick on homemade white bread, sometimes served with pickles on the side to cut the sweetness. Washed down with water or coffee. This was efficiency food. It could be made in bulk ahead of time. It didn't spoil sitting on the table during lunch. It provided calories and protein after a morning of sitting on hard benches. And children actually ate it without complaint. The lunch after church was called the fellowship meal, and it rotated with the church service through different homes. Hosting families would prepare church spread, bread, pickles, sometimes cheese, and coffee. Nothing fancy. Nothing that required hot food or last-minute preparation. The tradition started because cooking on Sunday was discouraged. Everything had to be prepared Saturday or before. Church spread could be mixed days in advance and stored in crocks. In some communities, different families had different secret ratios. The Yoder family made theirs sweeter, the Stoltzfus family added a pinch of salt. These preferences were passed down and debated with the same seriousness other communities debated theology. Number 9. Sauerkraut and pork with apples. This was November food. When the cabbage was harvested, the pigs were butchered, and the apples were still crisp in the cellar. Sauerkraut, made in late summer by shredding cabbage and fermenting it in large crocks in the cellar for weeks. Pork, shoulder, or ribs, from the fall butchering. Fresh apples, sliced thick, all layered in a roasting pan and cooked low and slow in the wood oven for hours. The sauerkraut melted into the pork. The apples broke down into sweet tart sauce. The pork fat rendered and basked everything in richness. The result was German comfort food perfected over centuries. This dish required advanced planning measured in months. The sauerkraut had to ferment starting in August. The pork came from pigs raised all summer and butchered when the weather turned cool. The apples were from trees planted by your great-grandfather decades ago. The smell that filled the house while this cooked tangy sauerkraut, sweet apples, roasting pork, meant winter was coming, but you'd be fed. It meant the harvest was complete and the hard work had paid off. Served with mashed potatoes made with milk from the morning milking and butter churned by hand the day before. Everything on the plate came from within a mile of the house. This was food that required no grocery store, no freezer, no modern convenience, just land, labor, and time. Number 10. Milk soup Eingemachts. If you're not Pennsylvania Dutch, milk soup sounds like something you'd feed a sick infant. To Amish families, it was breakfast. Fresh milk, heated gently in a pot on the wood stove. Brown sugar stirred in until dissolved. Cubes of stale bread, toasted in the oven until crispy. Dropped into the sweetened hot milk. Sometimes a stick of cinnamon, sometimes a pat of butter floating on top. The bread would soften in the hot milk, creating something between cereal and bread pudding. The brown sugar made it sweet enough to be interesting but not dessert. The butter added richness. This was what you made when the bread was going stale and you had excess milk, which, on a dairy farm, was most mornings. The milk came straight from the barn, still warm from the cow. The bread was from yesterday's baking. Children ate this before school on cold winter mornings. It was hot, filling, and required minimal preparation at 5 a.m. when chores started. It used ingredients that would otherwise go to waste. The trick was heating the milk slowly enough that it didn't scorch on the bottom of the pot. Amish women could tell by sound and smell when the temperature was perfect just before it would start to simmer. This was intuitive cooking passed through generations. Number 11. Red beet eggs. Pickled beet eggs. Those shocking magenta eggs in jars at Pennsylvania Dutch markets, they're not just for decoration. Hard-boiled eggs, peeled and submerged in beet pickling juice, the liquid left over from pickling beets, rich with vinegar, sugar, beets, and spices. Left in the cellar for days or weeks until the eggs turned deep purple red and absorbed the sweet, sour, earthy flavor. Sliced in half, the yolk stayed yellow while the white became crimson. The taste was tangy, slightly sweet, with the earthiness of beets permeating the egg. This was born from Amish resourcefulness. After pickling beets, you had this intensely flavored liquid left over. Throwing it away seemed wasteful. So you used it to preserve hard-boiled eggs, extending their shelf life and creating a completely new food. These appeared at church picnics, family reunions, and were served alongside cold cuts and bread for simple suppers. They were conversation starters. The shocking color demanded explanation. The pickling process meant eggs could last weeks in the cool cellar without refrigeration. In a time before electric refrigerators, this was crucial food preservation. Eggs were abundant in summer when chickens laid prolifically, so pickling them meant having eggs available during leaner months. The tradition came from German food preservation techniques brought to Pennsylvania in the 1700s and adapted with local ingredients. Number 12. Apple butter cooked in copper kettle. This wasn't something you made alone, and it wasn't something you made quickly. Apple butter days were community events. A 30-gallon copper kettle set up over an outdoor fire. Bushels of apples, peeled and quartered by hand, everyone helping. Dumped into the kettle with cider, sugar, and spices. Then stirring. For 8 to 12 hours, continuously, with a long wooden paddle. Taking turns because your arms would give out. While the apples slowly cooked down, darkened, caramelized, and transformed into thick, spreadable, deeply flavored apple butter. The smell carried across the farm. Cinnamon, apples, wood smoke, autumn. Neighbors could smell when someone was making apple butter and would stop by to help stir and share gossip. The copper kettle was essential. It conducted heat evenly, and something about the copper enhanced the color and flavor. These kettles were family heirlooms, passed down for generations, treated with the respect they deserved. This was October work, when apples hung heavy on the trees and needed to be preserved before frost. Apple butter would be sealed in jars and stored in the cellar, providing breakfast spread for the entire winter. Served on fresh bread, on preaching cookies, stirred into oatmeal, or eaten by the spoonful straight from the jar. The tradition is fading. Making apple butter takes an entire day, requires a copper kettle most families don't have, and needs hands that modern families can't provide. But in some Amish communities, Apple Butter Day still happens, usually in late September. Number 13. Brown butter noodles, browned butter, and noodles. Sometimes the simplest dishes are the most memorable. Homemade egg noodles, flour, eggs, salt, rolled thin, cut into wide strips, and hung to dry on a wooden drying rack. Boiled in salted water until tender. Then the magic. Butter melted in a cast iron skillet until it turned golden brown and nutty smelling. The cooked noodles tossed directly into the browned butter. That's it, noodles. Brown butter, maybe salt and pepper. The browned butter created a sauce that coated every noodle, rich and complex despite being just one ingredient. The homemade noodles had texture that store-bought versions couldn't match, tender but with a satisfying chew. This was Sunday supper, served alongside pot roast or fried chicken, or sometimes it was Sunday supper, period when the main dish was gone, and this was what stretched to feed everyone. Making the noodles was an all-day affair. The dough had to rest. It had to be rolled paper thin with a rolling pin on a floured table. Cut into even strips, hung to dry for hours. This was grandmother work, done in the afternoon while bread was rising and laundry was drying on the line. Browning the butter required attention. Take it too far and it burned, bitter and ruined. Not far enough and you missed the nutty complexity. Experienced cooks knew by smell exactly when to remove it from the heat. Number 14. Corn pie. Corn waffles, corn fritters. Not exactly pie, not exactly waffles, but somewhere in between, and cooked in a cast iron waffle iron held directly over the wood stove flames. Fresh corn, cut from the cob, mixed with eggs, flour, sugar, and milk to form a thick batter. Spooned into a cast iron waffle iron. The iron closed and held over the hot stove, or directly in the coals until the batter cooked through and formed crispy edges. The result was sweet from the corn, crispy outside, custardy inside, served with maple syrup or eaten plain. This was August food, when corn was so abundant you couldn't eat it fast enough and had to find creative ways to preserve it or transform it. These corn pies used up corn that was past its prime for eating on the cob, but still good for cooking. The cast iron waffle iron was a prized kitchen tool, heated directly in the fire coals or held above the flame, Making these required judgment: too hot and they burned, not hot enough and they didn't crisp. This was cooking that required your full attention, couldn't be rushed, and rewarded patience. Children would watch the process, waiting for the first one to come out of the iron, steam rising, edges golden and crackling. These were eaten hot, standing in the kitchen before the next batch was ready. Number 15. Fried corn meal mush, Scrapple's cousin. Not to be confused with Scrapple, this was vegetarian, made when the meat scraps had run out, but you still needed breakfast. Cornmeal cooked in water or milk until it formed a thick porridge, poured into a loaf pan, cooled overnight until it solidified into a firm block, sliced thick, fried in lard or butter until both sides developed a crispy, golden crust. The outside was crunchy, the inside was soft, creamy cornmeal with a subtle corn sweetness. Served with molasses or maple syrup, sometimes with sausage gravy if meat was available. This was Monday breakfast made from Sunday's leftover cornmeal mush that had been supper's starch. Instead of wasting it, you let it firm up and transformed it into something completely different the next morning. The key was slicing it thick enough that it held together, but thin enough that both sides crisped before the middle dried out, usually about half an inch. Amish women could eyeball this perfectly every time. Frying it required patient heat: too hot, and the outside burned before the inside warmed; too cool, and it fell apart. This was cast iron skillet cooking, where you learned the temperament of your pan and your stove through years of daily use. Number 16. Pickled red beet eggs and sausage. A heartier version of pickled eggs, this combined protein and preservation in one jar. Red beets, cooked and sliced, hard-boiled eggs, peeled, smoked sausage, sliced into rounds. All layered in jars and covered with spiced pickling brine vinegar, sugar, salt, cloves, and peppercorns. Sealed and stored in the cellar for weeks. Everything turned pink-red from the beets. The sausage absorbed the tangy brine. The eggs became both beautiful and flavorful. Pulled from the jar, this was an entire meal: protein, vegetables, and enough flavor to be interesting. This was put-up food, made in quantities during late summer when beets were harvested and stored for winter eating. The pickling brine preserved everything without refrigeration. Jars could sit in the cool cellar for months. These appeared at threshing dinners when neighboring farms helped each other harvest, and the host family fed dozens of workers. Quick, no cooking required food that could be pulled from the cellar and served immediately. The combination seems odd until you realize Amish cooking was about combining preservation methods. Pickling extended the life of eggs. Sausage stayed good. Because it was smoked and cured, and beets were naturally long-lasting, together they created something that was more than the sum of its parts. Number 17. Sour cream cookies. Sugar cookies with tang. These weren't your standard sugar cookies. The sour cream made them impossibly soft and gave them a subtle tang. Butter, sugar, eggs, sour cream, flour, and just a hint of nutmeg. The dough was rolled out, cut into circles with the rim of a drinking glass, and baked in the wood oven until barely golden. The texture was cake-like, so soft they'd melt in your mouth. The sour cream kept them moist for days in the cookie jar. The nutmeg added warmth without being identifiable, just enough to make you wonder what made them taste different from other sugar cookies. This was everyday cookie, not for special occasions, just for having around. They'd be in the cookie jar for after-school snacks, packed in lunches, offered to visitors who stopped by. The sour cream came from milk that had naturally soured, not spoiled, but cultured. Before refrigeration, milk would naturally ferment into clabbered milk or sour cream if left at room temperature. This was expected and used in cooking. Making these required understanding your wood oven. They needed gentle heat: too hot, and the bottoms burned before the tops baked through. Amish women would test oven temperature by holding their hand inside and counting how long they could stand it. This was baking as intuition. Number 18. Chicken corn soup for Thrashers. When 20 men arrived at your farm to help thresh wheat, you needed to feed them a meal they'd remember. Whole chickens, boiled until falling off the bone tender. The meat stripped and returned to the broth. Fresh corn, cut from the cob, lots of it. Hard-boiled eggs, chopped. Homemade noodles, celery, onions, salt, pepper, and saffron for color and subtle flavor. The result was a soup so thick with ingredients it was almost a stew, served with fresh bread and butter. Sometimes accompanied by 7 sweets and 7 sours, pickles, relishes, jellies, and preserves served in small dishes. This was made in enormous quantities, 30-quart pots on the wood stove, simmering for hours. The kitchen would be sweltering from the stove heat, and multiple women would work together preparing components. Threshing day was a community event. Before mechanical harvesters, farmers would help each other bring in wheat, moving from farm to farm throughout the season. The host family's reputation rested partly on how well they fed the workers. The saffron was expensive, imported, and considered essential for authentic chicken corn soup. It turned the broth golden yellow and added a subtle earthy flavor. Using saffron showed respect for the workers and pride in the meal. This soup showed up at weddings, funerals, church dinners, and any time the community gathered. It was Pennsylvania Dutch identity in a bowl. Number 19. Spiced cantaloupe. Pickled cantaloupe. When you think pickled foods, cantaloupe probably doesn't come to mind. But Amish women pickled everything that grew. Firm, slightly underripe cantaloupe cut into chunks, cooked in a spiced vinegar syrup, with cinnamon, cloves, and sugar until the melon became translucent but still held its shape. Canned in jars for winter eating. The result was sweet, tangy, and spiced a condiment that served as dessert. Served alongside ham at Sunday dinner or eaten straight from the jar as a sweet pickle side dish. This originated from abundance when the cantaloupe crop was overwhelming and you couldn't eat them all fresh. Instead of letting them rot, you preserved them. The sweet pickle flavor was polarizing. Children either loved them or refused to touch them. Adults appreciated them more, serving them at special meals when you wanted to impress visitors with your preservation skills. Making these required perfect timing. Too ripe and the melon would dissolve into mush during cooking. Not ripe enough and they'd be hard and flavorless. Experienced cooks could tell by pressing the stem end of the melon exactly when they were ready for pickling. These sat on cellar shelves in glass jars, glowing amber in the dim light rose of summer, preserved for winter eating. Number 20. Half-moon pies. Fried hand pies. Before Hot Pockets, there were half-moon pies, hand pies sealed and fried in lard. Pie dough rolled thin, cut into circles. Filled with dried apple schnitz that had been reconstituted and spiced, or with thick applesauce, or sometimes with mincemeat, folded in half, edges crimped with a fork. Fried in hot lard until golden and puffy. The crust was flaky and crisp from frying. The filling was hot, sweet, and slightly spiced. These were eaten hot or cooled, packed in lunches saved for snacks. This was field food. Men would take these to the fields during harvest, eating them cold at midday. They were portable, filling, and required no utensils. The name comes from the shape, a half circle that looked like a crescent moon. Also called preaching pies in some communities because they were pocket-sized and could be eaten during long church services without making a mess. Frying or baking them required careful temperature control. Too hot and the outside burned before the inside warmed. Too cool and they absorbed grease and became soggy. The lard had to shimmer, but not smoke. Amish women judged this by sight alone. These appeared at social gatherings, fundraisers, and were sold at farm stands. The dough was made from the same basic pie dough recipe used for everything else, proving that Amish cooking was about versatility. Number 21. Potato filling, Amish dressing. This is what Amish families served at Thanksgiving instead of stuffing or alongside stuffing if you were feeling ambitious. Mashed potatoes mixed with chunks of toasted bread, sautéed celery and onions, cooked in butter, eggs to bind, milk to moisten, and chicken broth for flavor. Baked in a large pan until the top was golden and slightly crisp. The texture was somewhere between mashed potatoes and bread stuffing. The flavor was rich, savory, and deeply comforting. It was the dish everyone fought over at holiday meals. This stretched expensive ingredients like butter and eggs by bulking them with potatoes, which every farm had in abundance. It made a small chicken feed more people by turning it into a side dish rather than the main event. The dish was baked in wood ovens that had just roasted the turkey or chicken, using the residual heat efficiently. Nothing was wasted, not heat, not ingredients, not effort. This appears at every major Amish gathering, weddings, funerals, holidays. It's comfort food that connects generations. Grandmothers teaching granddaughters the proper ratio of potato to bread, the right amount of celery, the exact consistency. Number 22. Schnitz pie, dried apple pie. Before frozen foods, dried apples were how summer fruit survived to winter pies. Dried apple slices soaked overnight in water until plump, cooked with cinnamon, sugar, and sometimes orange peel until tender and flavorful. Poured into a double crust pie and baked until golden. The filling was concentrated apple flavor, sweeter and more intense than fresh apple pie. The dried apples had a slightly chewy texture that was distinctive. This was autumn condensed into pastry. The drying process started in August. Apples sliced thin, cored, and threaded onto strings or laid on screens. Hung in the summer kitchen or set in the sun. Days of drying until the slices were leathery and preserved. Those dried apple rings hanging in the kitchen meant security. It meant you'd have pie in January when snow covered the ground and the orchard was bare. Making this pie in February felt like defying winter. The smell of cinnamon and apples baking would fill the house, and for a moment you could pretend it was summer again. The pie required planning months in advance. You couldn't decide on Tuesday you wanted this pie on Wednesday. This was the reward for summer labor. Number 23. Cottage cheese, homemade pot cheese. Before grocery stores sold it in plastic tubs, cottage cheese was something you made when milk was abundant. Fresh milk left to naturally sour overnight or soured intentionally with vinegar or lemon juice, heated gently until curds formed, poured through cheesecloth and hung to drain for hours. The curds were rinsed, then mixed with cream and salt. The result was mild, slightly tangy, with curds that were soft and moist. Served with fresh tomatoes and salt, or eaten with jam, or used in baking. This was summer food, made when cows were producing more milk than the family could drink. Instead of wasting it, you transformed it into cheese that would last a few days longer. Making cottage cheese required understanding milk chemistry developed through experience, not recipes. You could tell by smell and look when the milk was ready to curdle, by feel when the curds were properly cooked, by taste when the salt ratio was perfect. The way the liquid drained off wasn't thrown away. It was fed to pigs, used to make bread, or drunk fresh for its protein content. Every byproduct had a purpose. Number 24. Pepper cabbage, hot pepper, relish. This wasn't just coleslaw, this was cabbage with purpose, a condiment that added heat and crunch to simple meals. Cabbage, shredded fine. Sweet bell peppers and hot peppers, diced, onions, chopped, mixed with salt, sugar, vinegar, and mustard seeds. Cooked briefly to blend flavors but left crunchy, canned in jars. The result was tangy, spicy, crunchy, perfect, served cold with ham sandwiches, hot dogs, or alongside pork chops. The heat level varied by family preference, from mild to mouth-scorching. This was September work, when cabbage heads were harvested and peppers hung heavy on the plants. Multiple families would often work together, processing bushels of vegetables in assembly line fashion. The combination of preservation techniques, vinegar, salt, sugar, and canning meant these jars would last through winter. Opened in February, they brought summer's heat to cold weather meals. Every family's recipe was slightly different, adjusted over generations to suit their tastes. Some added celery seed, others turmeric for color, some added extra peppers to make it truly hot. This appeared at every summer picnic and winter church supper, served in small dishes alongside the main meal, adding brightness to heavy comfort food. Number 25. Whoopie Pies. Original Maine, Pennsylvania debate. Let's end with the dessert that sparked a regional rivalry and defined packed lunches for generations. 2 soft chocolate cake-like cookies, made with cocoa, buttermilk, and shortening. A marshmallow cream filling or sometimes vanilla buttercream sandwiched between them, big enough to require 2 hands. The chocolate part was cakey and tender, with a deep cocoa flavor. The filling was sweet, creamy, and impossibly white. Together, they were childhood joy, wrapped in wax paper. The origin story is disputed. Maine claims whoopie pies were invented there. Pennsylvania Dutch country insists they were Amish creations, made by women who would bake cake batter as cookies, then sandwich leftover frosting between them. When children found them in their lunch pails, they'd shout, "Whoopie!" The name itself is debated. Some say it came from children's excitement. Others claim it was Amish slang for something special. The truth is probably lost to time. These became the quintessential Amish bakery item, sold at farmers markets and roadside stands across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. Every Amish bakery had their own recipe, guarded closely, with loyal customers who would drive miles for their favorite version. Making these required precision. The cakes had to be uniform in size, so the sandwiches were even. The filling had to be the right consistency, too loose and it oozed out, too thick and it was hard to bite through. This was baking as engineering. The tradition continues today, but something changed. Commercial versions never quite taste like the ones made in Amish kitchens, where women measured by feel, baked in temperamental wood ovens, and made filling from recipes memorized through repetition. There you have it. 25 recipes that fed generations without a single electric appliance. These weren't just meals. They were preservation methods, community gatherings, and practical solutions to life without refrigeration or modern convenience. So here's the question. Which of these would you actually make? Which ones made you curious enough to try? Which ones made you realize how disconnected we've become from where our food comes from? Share your stories, before they're forgotten too. Subscribe for more food history, lost recipes, and the stories that deserve to be remembered.